morning, everybody. Delighted to see so many of you back again. For those of you who don't know me, again, I'm Muireann Kelleher, and we're going to chat now for the next 50, 60 minutes about a topic of inconsiderable importance. And I am joined by a wonderful panel to do that. There was a conceit nearly, I suppose, that I was thinking of when we set up this panel in the first instance. And it was about a tale of two number 10s. And in many ways, I suppose, the beginning of the Brexit, or the manifestation that became Brexit, can be seen as a failure of the two-party first-past-the-post system in the UK to contain the growing multitudes or the splintering multitudes. And I'm going to ask our first two speakers here to engage with us on that topic. So we're joined here to my immediate left by Gavin Kelly, who is the CEO of the Resolution Trust in the UK. He was formerly Deputy Chief of Staff in Gordon Brown's government. I have been a follower for a long time of Gavin's work in the Resolution Foundation, and convening these kind of conversations makes you into some kind of a weird Twitter stalker. So there was two things. Well, the first was the name, back to the minister's comment. I was hoping we had an in with that. The second one was a tweeting by Gavin of a Bobby Kennedy speech on St. Patrick's Day. And the third one was a gig in Union Chapel. So on those three strikes, I hoped we were in. And we came to be, so I'm delighted that he's with us. Matthew O Toole has been a Brexit spokesman for two UK Prime Ministers, David Cameron and Theresa May. And since he has left that position in the last year, he's written with some frequency, and I would say with a huge subtlety and poignancy, about the multiple identities which he brought into a role like that, and which he brings into the communications around it now, as a son of County Down, as an Irish passport holder, finding himself at the heart of a number 10 Brexit communications scenario. Tony Connelly, I suppose Tony actually, known to some of you as our man in Brussels, is otherwise the head of a tribute band for Scullion, which turned out to be, I think, the more important part of getting him here. But and for those of you who missed himself and Luke in tribute yesterday, it was some tribute. And so thank you very much, Tony, for being with us. So obviously then moving on from number 10, what we wanted to bring into it was this marks a departure in Ireland's relationship with the EU, and we wanted Tony to talk to that. We're joined also by Her Excellency Deike Potzel from the German ambassador to Ireland. She has been with us here for over a year now, and I think has some very interesting perspectives to bring to how we begin to think about a new relationship with Europe. And, you know, your term started with us emerging, I suppose, out of one immediate post-Eurozone crisis, Ireland's dominant characteristic of the relationship with Europe, into a newer phase. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then Aziliz Gouez, a native of Dingle, a citizen of Dingle, shall we say now, not a native, but we're very proud to have her call it home at the moment. Aziliz, I'm going to talk to Aziliz more about the changing nature of Europe, because as Ireland prepares for a different post-UK centred, or not a UK anchored, shall we say, in some senses, set of relationships in Europe, the backdrop to which those new relationships will be taking place is a rapidly changing place. Aziliz is an anthropologist by training. She has studied in depth identity formation in Europe. She has recently spent some extensive periods in Poland and in Romania. out of Dingle at the moment. She is part of the founding of a new political party in France, Place Publique, and she brings a unique vantage point both to Ireland and to Ireland's relationship with Europe. Previous to this, she was a speechwriter for our president, so she has just come out of inhabiting that role, and I think brings some enormous perspectives with all of her previous experiences. So this is an amazing panel. I'm delighted to have them be here. We're going to talk a little bit about the arithmetic of Westminster, but we're not going to focus on it hugely. Tony covered it off on the podcast on Thursday, so we're going to cover a range in a slightly broader context. Gavin, I'm going to start with you, and I'm going to ask you in no short order, how, from your perspective, did we get here?
That's the question. That's the question, and it's just as well I've got a kind of soothing view out the window. It's a torrid story. You can go back as far as you want. I think, in the interest of time, it's a long journey. I mean, I think we'll talk, and Matthew can talk authoritatively about what happened more recently under David Cameron and so on. And I wouldn't want him to not take a lot of the blame for where we are. But and I could really go out on one. But that view is soothing me, so I'm not going to rage yet about that. But I think it would be wrong and shallow just to sort of pinpoint the internal Tory politics which led to a referendum, which led to where we are now, because it's a bigger story. And I guess the European project is a project that we, it was a party we were late to, and then when we got there, we kind of spent half the time thinking, God, are we at the wrong party? Like, did we do this? Is this? And if you go back to the 50s, we treated the idea with scorn and contempt when the European community was first founded on its early origins. In the 60s, we started to sort of get a sense that things weren't going so great for us, but we were still pretty scornful. It was through to the late 60s and the early 70s when actually the relative decline, economically speaking, of Britain meant that was a change, which led to membership, which led to the famous referendum in '75, which is actually, if anyone's interested in this, it's fascinating to look back at, and it's relevant to this question because I think 1975 was the last time that you had British politicians speaking emotionally with real power and purchase about the European project. You had people who fought in the war. You had posters saying nationalism kills. That was one of the main posters used in the kind of yes to staying in campaign. You had Dennis Healey, you had Callaghan, you had people who'd sort of put their bodies on the line as part of a European sort of project, if you like, as well as an economic kind of argument. So they were both there. And since that time, without going through all the different kind of years since that kind of 35, 40-year period, we haven't had an emotional argument, I feel, which has had any traction, or even really haven't had one attempted, to sort of renew. Obviously, it would change because that generation was passing, but we haven't renewed an emotional connection between British politics and the European community and then the European Union. And we've paid a price for that. And I think all governments share some blame for that. I think there's, I worked for basically the whole of the Labour years, and I think that, we took part in some othering of Brussels. Brussels wasn't us. We weren't part of it. It was stuff done to us. We didn't particularly benefit. We had to pay. But it was a low-key register. I mean, it wasn't, it sort of wasn't central to who we were. Occasionally you'd hear pro-European speeches, but basically it was a low-key tactical thing. Obviously in the 80s before us, it was, under Thatcher, it was much kind of louder volume resentment. But there was a long backstory, which should lead to no great surprise, that over time, and of course, the British media is a whole other story, and that, which I could go into in terms of how the media has sort of channeled this debate. But we have I think, you can go right back for 40 years before you get to the more recent politics of the Conservative Party, which led to them to do what they did. But I think the other point I would make about how we got here, in terms of sort of the wider sweep, it is quite hard to think of a worst moment in our history to have called for a referendum. Both, we had the worst decade of wage growth. We had a wage disaster in our country. We haven't seen anything like it since the Napoleonic Wars. We had austerity, the likes of which we have never seen, which has smashed the relationship that people thought they had between themselves and the state. The state had failed communities in a way that people just, people didn't have high views of the state, but they thought some things would be there for them, which were removed. Political parties were held in universally low esteem, following on from the expenses, kind of the MPs' expenses crisis and so on. And that was a big background factor, I think. And then there was this kind of demographic bulge which happened, which was that we have an awful lot of baby boomers around and they all vote. And in Britain, they are uniquely Eurosceptical group. The silent generation, the people who fought in World War II, were fading away. They were much more pro-European, kind of for obvious reasons. And the people of my age and then the next generation are markedly more pro-European in their attitudes. So there was this moment where the electorate had a kind of distinctly sceptical take.
Sean.
And that, now in part, that's why you can argue that's why we had the referendum, because those people really matter, particularly, and they particularly matter to the Conservative Party, given the demographics of the Conservative Party. But if you didn't want to be leaving, and let's not forget, the people who called the referendum didn't want to leave, they campaigned to remain, you could not have chosen a worse moment in our history to roll the dice in our future. And that's what happened.
You got the job.
Lucky you.
Among others. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I agree with basically everything Gavin said there in terms of the long-run perspective on Britain's relationship with Europe and the forces, structural and otherwise, that kind of guided the ship towards Brexit. I think the kind of immediate run-up, so all those things are true, and I think, and the kind of erosion of trust generally in elites that we've seen across liberal democracies, it didn't help to be having a referendum where the entire elite, not just the political elite, but the financial elite, not all of the media elite, clearly some of them went along with Brexit, but most elites were telling people, you've got to do this thing. It's this thing that we've kind of been mildly slagging off for several decades. You've got to go along with it in terms of membership. But the other point I wanted to make, and I think it's really relevant to where we are and what we've been discussing about, well, we will probably come on to Ireland and the particular difficulties of the island of Ireland in relation to Brexit. But related to that, I think why the immediate run-up to the history of the immediate run-up to the referendum in 2016 is really crucial, is that I think it's becoming clear that one of the reasons why the referendum was lost was, I think, a misapprehension about what the United Kingdom was as a state, really, and where it had got to, and by which I mean that it's a nation in some senses, but in other senses a union of nations, part of which is in another island where there's a space where people have multiple identities and they identify with different nations. Now, the particular chronological run-up to the 2016 referendum included something people don't often relate to 2016, but the 2014 Scottish referendum. Yeah. And in addition to austerity, which Gavin talked about, that period was marked by a sense that the UK might break up because Scotland might vote to secede, if you like, in 2014. The Conservative government and the machinery of Whitehall, which I was still then a part, I should say, I was a civil servant, won the Scottish referendum in 2014. Oh, sorry.
Throwing
shoes falling, absolutely. That's a brilliant metaphor. Try and weave that into my comments. And then the shoe finally dropped. The shoe finally dropped on Brexit. But the 2014 Scottish referendum was won by focusing voters, or it was perceived to have been won by focusing voters' attention on a very narrow question of economic gain or loss. Yeah. The yes side in the referendum got people very passionate about obviously national identity, but also a broader and more positive civic nationalism took hold in Scotland. There were various narratives of Scottishness and the potential for an independent Scotland that got people very positive and excited. There were also obviously some less positive aspects of the yes campaign, but that awakening of identity in Scotland and Scottish nationalism was defeated quite narrowly in that referendum by focusing people on economic gain and loss, and that was the Conservative government, and I don't mean this as a Tory bashing exercise, but that was a tactic that won that referendum. In 2015, as Gavin probably remembers,
something of a template.
It was a template, and in 2015 the general election was won in a similar way against Ed Miliband's Labour by focusing people very narrowly on economic gain and loss. And so when it came to the 2016 referendum, in a sense, there was a third attempt at winning that battle, and for various reasons, possibly because the people, the baby bulge bracket, the baby boomer bracket, sorry, that Gavin mentioned, had actually they were the people who were worried about their mortgages and their pensions, and they were likely to do the economically, kind of cautious thing in relation to the Scottish referendum, in relation to the 2015 general election. They didn't do what was perceived to be the economically cautious thing in 2016. And I think the reason they didn't is because there was a misapprehension of what the United Kingdom was and how the different bits interacted with one another, including, for example, the fact that actually part of David Cameron's reaction to the referendum in Scotland was to weaponize Scottish nationalism, in order to weaponize a resentment in England towards Scottish nationalism, which helped him, clean out Labour in 2015. So that's one aspect of the contradictions in the United Kingdom before we even get on to the bit of the United Kingdom that's on the island of Ireland.
And your frustration at seeing maybe some of those identity questions not brought or not understood within the context of the campaign as it was being rolled out?
Yeah, very much so. It's probably worth saying that in the context of running the campaign the way it was run, as in it was run with a very short lead-in.
Yeah.
Cameron had a renegotiation which began at the end of 2015. It's mad to think this is all within the last 3 years, but at the end of 2015, about 6 months after he got re-elected as Prime Minister, he basically went round Europe and he had said in 2013 he was going to completely renegotiate Britain's membership. In fact, he implied that there would be fundamental reform of the entire European project, which was never ever going to happen, obviously. Then in late 2015, he took himself around European capitals, started renegotiating Britain's membership at a time whenever the Eurozone crisis wasn't quite finished and there was a migration crisis that was rising. So other EU leaders were faced with this British Prime Minister coming around and saying, okay, forget about that for a second. I'd like to talk about why I want to have a break on benefits entitlement for EU migrants. Actually, he did quite well in terms of getting some concessions. You can argue whether he should have got them or not, but he did okay. When he came back, number 10, where I was working at the time, had a very compressed referendum campaign.
And obviously the
period.
Leave campaign had a longer
Leave campaign much longer. If you're Dan Hannan or Douglas Carswell or Bill Cash or whoever you've been campaigning with for decades, it's been, in the case of Dan Hannan, you've been a pamphleteer for many decades. You've been writing blogs, op-eds, giving speeches, getting people activated and excited, talking about getting, global Britain, getting Britain out of the European Union and into the world. You've been practicing all these lines, finessing them for a very long time, and that showed because the Remain campaign didn't have, as Gavin mentioned, didn't have the vocalization, didn't have the lines ready, didn't have its narrative ready. What we did was basically regurgitate what had happened in Scotland and in the general election the year before, which was basically, if you vote to leave, you'll be, after 15 years, you'll be £2,000 a year worse off. Those numbers, no one A, believed them, and B, they felt insulted by being kind of narrowly focused on this question. So there was no real attempt at a pro-European thing. And on the identity question, I suppose why I mentioned the narrow economic point is that it was always going to be extremely difficult in the context of that compressed campaign to explain the complexities of Northern Ireland. Yeah. And that was something we didn't really attempt. So the frustration was both that we didn't really attempt to do it, but also the sense that there was something very headlong about the way the entire process happened without consideration of the severity of the consequences for the most contradictory place in the UK, which also happens to be the most contradictory place in Ireland.
And Tony, you found yourself in Brussels during, as Matthew has talked about, obviously there was a specific Eurozone context to the actions of David Cameron at the time. We were obviously living a very different experience, but of other Eurozone consequences. So when we came into this period, which arguably marks quite Ireland coming out of a sense of asking a different question, well, what did Europe do for us in that period? Now finding ourselves in a post-Brexit situation where from immediately post the vote, there was a very definite stance taken in Ireland about wrapping itself in the European project relative to the UK's decision. How have your experiences been of Ireland in Brussels and the European attitudes during that period?
Yeah, so we had just come out of the bailout in, I guess, 2013 was the sort of emergence. Then you had the European elections in 2014. Then you had the migration crisis in 2015. So we were into somewhat challenging territory in terms of migration because, on the one hand, the stories we've heard already this morning, the pitch for Ireland and immigration was a very resonant one, but at the same time, we were kind of on the edge of the physical problem of migration, and the government was faced with a bit of a challenge as to how many people we could take in because we have opt-outs and opt-ins on migration policy at an EU level, and then suddenly Brexit came along in the middle of this, and I think. Immediately after David Cameron's speech in 2013, the famous Bloomberg speech in January, there was a meeting the next day between Rory Montgomery and Tom Scholar. Rory Montgomery was Ireland's permanent representative, and Tom Scholar was his counterpart on the British side. And they kind of looked through the speech at an ambassador's breakfast and said, "Yeah, this could be something. We'll see how we go with that one." But there was no real panic at that stage. And I think for the next while, all the focus was on what kind of concessions can David Cameron get, and then how can he sell them. And that actually consumed quite a bit of energy and oxygen at EU level. But then I think the Irish government did see a real danger that this was going down. And I think it was because a lot of ministers were going to the UK to take part in campaign meetings. Dan Mulhall, who was the ambassador, was very active on social media. He was writing op-eds. There were a lot of meetings with Irish clubs. And I mean, the demographic that Gavin mentioned, there were Irish people who were in their 60s and 70s who were not that open to this worry about the Northern Irish peace process and so on. But to get to your question in general, there was no question that Ireland was going to have to embed itself completely in the European family as a response to Brexit. The morning after...
Was that really no question in the sense of there was obviously a series of voices here at the time in Ireland can do nothing except fall in back in here against our biggest trading partner on an indigenous basis. Just in terms of Irish foreign policy, I think that marks. It's interesting that you say there was no question.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, in any of the discussions I've had with people, it never came up as an issue. I mean, what did come up was how do we deal with this car crash? I mean, it was actually quite choreographed the morning after the referendum vote. I mean, there had been massive wargaming by the different government departments, by the Department of the Taoiseach and the Foreign Affairs as to how to manage the results as they came in. There was a whole sequencing of different government departments. It was highly, tightly choreographed, and they had different statements ready for different outcomes. And when the Leave outcome happened, there was a sequence of things that were just triggered automatically. And one of them was that Enda Kenny would come out on the stage at government buildings, and there would be an Irish flag and an EU flag, and it was a very deliberate signal that this is where we would be. An interesting question then is to what extent was Europe ready for the Irish pitch? I mean, someone mentioned yesterday the sore thumb. In the Versailles Peace Treaty talks, Ireland. Yeah. Could Ireland come up? We have a sore thumb. There's been mass slaughter. Like, what are we going to do about Northern Ireland? So in some senses, the EU was immediately alert to the Irish issue. Angela Merkel actually raised it at a meeting. I think it was a G20 meeting in Mongolia that summer. And she said there was an implication for the Northern Irish peace process. And this was quite long before it became part of the DNA of the negotiations. Ireland was seen as a country that had struggled through the bailout, the humiliation. Ireland had followed taken its medicine, if you like, despite tremendous resentment at home. Ireland was seen as a good European, and that Ireland would have to be looked after. But I think fundamentally, there was a very simple formulation here, and that was Ireland is staying in the European Union. We're at the table, we're in the room, Britain is leaving. There's always going to be a a bias towards Ireland in that situation. That's not to say that Ireland had to go out and actually educate different capitals as to what the peace process was about. I mean, people knew there was a peace process that the EU had been partially involved in, mainly after the fact, through funding, and it had this more abstract involvement as a space for British and Irish ministers to meet and discuss Irish issues and so on. But I think the government felt that there were a lot of countries that are, the further away you got from the European seaboard, there was less nuanced information. So that all had to be done. And I remember there was a circular sent by the Department of Foreign Affairs to, it was kind of a non-paper to the senior negotiators, Michel Barnier, Bertrand Michelson, who's the Secretary General of the European Council, Donald Tusk. Basically, like a 4-pager explaining the Irish position, the peace process. There was a very interesting little line in there saying, XXX, but this could have a knock-on effect on Ireland's budgetary situation. So I think it's a little kind of reminder. We had the bailout, you don't want to mess with this. So that was the message. And I think it was a receptive audience. But I think at the same time, Ireland was being told, we can't promise you that the world won't change because of Brexit, because it will change. So there were some qualifications there. And if you look, finally, if you look at the overall trajectory between when the Article 50 was triggered to the withdrawal agreement last Sunday, there was very precise unity of purpose, and the Irish priorities that were embedded in the DNA of the process didn't really change, and were actually followed through and supported by the other member states.
And actually it was around, she said no, not in the least bit self-referentially, it was about this time last year when we were here at Ireland's Edge that the backstop actually became concreted. And over the course of the year we now find ourselves in a position where the arithmetic in Westminster comes sharply into focus as we move now through into December. Will you give us your perspective on how it would appear that we are talking about the margin of defeat and the implications of varying margins of defeat rather than the prospect of it passing at the first?
Yeah, I think nobody believes it'll pass at the first. So it's all about the plan B and what that might mean. You have 650 MPs. The Speaker, John Bercow, and 3 of his deputies don't vote. The Sinn Féin MPs obviously won't be there. Then you have about 90 Conservative MPs who will vote against it. You have all of the Labour Party, with the exception of maybe 12 or 13 Labour MPs who probably won't vote against, who probably will vote for it. You've got the Scottish Nationalists who vote against it, so we can assume it'll be a defeat. How heavy that defeat is will be important for her future. If it's a very heavy defeat, she might face a no confidence motion from her party. The government might face a no confidence motion. There is talk of a second Commons vote at a certain point, but what could she bring to the whips to turn the tide in her favour? People have talked about the markets reacting badly, but then other people say the markets have priced all of this in already. So it's an extremely weird situation as a journalist or a commentator, because the normal rules of prediction just don't apply.
Which in some sense makes it quite safe for me to direct the question to you, Gavin, and say, give us your perspective on what happens when the normal rules don't apply here.
The one thing we can talk about is that, of course, everything we say will be wrong, because none of us know. I think, he says, nonetheless, I'll go on and make my prediction. I think if the government only loses, which is quite a remarkable thing to say, but only loses by 20 to 30, it will feel like a quiet victory for them, because they will then believe that they will get there on the second vote. There will be a second vote. I think there's no prospect of her winning the first time round, but I think they will believe that there's a kind of thing where people need to demonstrate, people feel the need to sort of show what they'd really like to happen on the first vote. So like Brexiteers are not going to want to trade easily and compromise in the first vote. But if they lose by 20 to 30, I think they'll think that the main action will be whittling down the number of softer Brexiteers and getting them over the line to support the government. Plus, they'll also think there'll be a few Labour people who won't vote for this, but will abstain because they'd like to actually vote for it for their own reasons. And so I think they'll sneak over the line. And I think that if they lose by 20 to 30, I think they will sneak over the line. And that's the good scenario, because it means that the action for the Prime Minister is basically sort of persuading Conservatives, and that's kind of what she can do, and she knows her party well. If she loses by 70, 80, 90, 100, we are in a completely different place. I mean, I think for a number of reasons. First, the dominant assumption will be, first of all, the switch will be we're going to fall out of this. Suddenly there'll be no one at the moment really thinks that. People think that something will turn up. I'm not saying we will have a hard Brexit, but there'll suddenly be a real sense of fear. First of all, I think there'll simultaneously be a vote by the MPs, which 500 or so MPs will support, saying under no circumstances will there be a no-deal Brexit. So I think that has no legal bearing, that has no consequence at all in terms of what actually will happen, but it will send a signal to the British public that this House of Commons will not stand by. So I think that will happen, but what that means we don't know. And then something remarkable is going to happen. Either there's going to be a Conservative Prime Minister, Theresa May, who passionately opposes free movement of labour, is going to actually tack to an EEA position. I don't think she will do that. I think she'd resign before she did that personally. I think it's
the Norway.
Yeah, so yeah. To a Norway position. I think she won't do that, but there'll be a big burst of energy behind that, and you'll suddenly see big groups of Labour and Conservative MPs coming out together saying this is the solution, including members of the cabinet. So there'll be energy behind that. I don't think she'll go there in the end. I think she'd rather walk. A second referendum, polls will come out showing 65% of the public are now thinking about a second referendum. There'll be a burst of energy behind that. I genuinely don't see where 320-odd votes come from for a second referendum. There's a lot of Labour MPs who really don't want one for their own reasons. But that may change. But I think she would go before she came out in favour of that, and it would just be stunning if we had basically for that to pass, you'd need 35 or so Conservative MPs to support it. 70-odd% of all Tory members passionately oppose it, right? And the great majority of Tory MPs passionately oppose it. So for a government to take a bill through the House creating a referendum that basically all their voters and all their MPs really don't want, it's just, I mean, we've never been there before, so I'm not sure about that. So I think the risk of a no-deal Brexit goes up very significantly, but I also think there is something which we haven't really thought about, which is basically Theresa May cutting and pasting any amendment that Labour lays, without getting into the weeds of this. The Labour proposed Brexit, which would be a permanent customs union, lots of nice stuff about protecting Labour workers, and any other Labour language you want. She will say, I'll have all of that. I'll get rid of, I want Labour's Brexit. And I will put down amendment. My second vote will be for Labour's Brexit. That's the only thing I'm backing. If she did that, then she's at war with her own party, and she may not be able to survive that. There would be a confidence motion, although I think that she may win that vote, even in these circumstances. But for her to win that vote, my guess is she would have to give something to her party, and the only thing she's got left to give is herself. So I could imagine a world in which she says, vote for this. It's the only way Britain avoids the catastrophe of no deal, and it will be a catastrophe. But I won't be your Prime Minister going forward. I'll get us out, and I'll go in April or March 30th or whatever it is. Because when it comes to it, and I've seen this I saw Gordon do this when he was trying to forge a coalition. When you've got nothing else to give, you make the promise of your own head. And actually, even though it doesn't mean, I mean, what does that mean? What she could say to her party is, you will have another go at this. Back this deal to get out, because most of you want out. And then you can have another go with a new leader, and they can rip this up.
But then that's correct, but that promise that she makes, if she made that promise, it would be, in a sense, it would be more plausible to the Tory backbenchers in the context of the backstop as currently formulated rather than a Labour permanent customs union, because if you're legally pledged to a permanent customs union, then you can never, you can obviously unilaterally walk away, and with all the consequences of that, but a permanent customs union is one that the UK could never get out of, whereas the backstop, which obviously has caused a lot of sound and fury among hard Brexiteers in the DUP, the backstop is one that theoretically in 2 years,
Yeah.
3 years, 10
You
years'
could.
time, they could walk away from. They
Sure.
could say, actually, you know what, we're not really that interested, really, in whether regulatory, you know, a few regulatory checks on industrial goods and agri
Yeah.
goods between Britain and Northern Ireland matters that much. So that, you know, all that is being weighed up, and one of the interesting dynamics, of course, has been the DUP being echoed by Corbyn's Labour Party.
Sure. But they'll have to make their choice, because either we're going to crash out or something like that's going to happen, or there's going to be a referendum. There isn't, you know, and they're all bad choices if you're the Conservative Party.
So, Deike, if I might ask you to reflect a little bit on your time in Ireland, you find yourself then in a country reimagining its relationship with the Europe which is changing itself, with your own country, Germany, which is coming out of one period of very sustained leadership and looking at its choices now. What I suppose has surprised you about your time here, and what do you see as the major, what are the progressions that you see in the Irish-German relationship?
The first part of the question, can you hear me? The surprises, there weren't actually that many, I have to say. You get a little bit of preparation before you come here, so there weren't that many surprises, really. I mean, but what is sort of striking is that obviously Brexit, since we're talking about that, is far more important here than it is on what you call the continent.
Yeah.
Like in public debate in Germany, it's far more about the migration crisis and other issues than Brexit, really. It is an issue, but it's not as present as it is here. So that didn't surprise me, but it's still striking.
Yes.
And I was thinking when we were talking here, you know, if there was anything good about Brexit, it is, I think, three things really. First of all, in my mind, first of all, it's more people now realize the importance of the European Union and how wonderful this project is and what it has given to us. And there is more talk in society also about it, which I think is really important and needed. Second thing is a lot of also young people realize that voting is important and it does matter. I think that's also very, very important. And the third thing really is that we, and not only Ireland, but we are looking more closely at the importance of our bilateral relations. Yeah. And like we started a like-minded initiative within the European Union and looked very thoroughly at who actually shares our values and our policies, and maybe who did we neglect as well, or neglect or didn't use the full potential as such. And we realized that Ireland definitely is a country to look at more closely. And interestingly enough, at the same time, also the Irish looked at Europe more closely. And like what the minister described this morning, you know, with the global footprint, but that is also true for Europe. Yeah. How to foster and strengthen the relationships there. So the Taoiseach launched a review of German-Irish relations in April. With 23 recommendations how to deepen our relations, which was a very good start. So we also looked at the relations, as I said. We now have more visits back and forth. We also had the first state secretary consultations ever in our bilateral relations just 2 weeks ago. So there really is a lot happening. They drew up a joint action plan with very concrete proposals of where to interact, and that's not only on European issues, but also things like Africa. You know, how can we work together on those issues? How can we work together more closely in the United Nations? Because we will be a non-permanent member of the Security Council 1919-21, and Ireland is also is a candidate for a seat in 22. Yeah. So there's a lot we can do together, and that is actually, it's wonderful to be here at a time where I really feel that there is a new dynamism and more interest in each other. And that's not only true for Germany, but for other countries as well, and that's wonderful. I think that is a positive outcome, really, of that very sad Brexit story we're looking at.
And while all that is happening at official level and between governments and between the ministries, you've made a particular effort to get out and about around the country. I think you're on your 3rd or 4th visit down here to Kerry now. In your engagement with more broader swathes of Irish life, what is your sense of the relationship to Europe, but Germany in particular within that, at the communities that you've been visiting and engaging with?
Well, I'm always surprised about how many people-to-people relations there are. On the other hand, there clearly is more potential. Like also if you look at the number of Irish who speak a foreign language or learn a foreign language in schools, I think there we really want to put more focus on, also as Germany. It's also part of that review that I mentioned, a German language strategy here in Ireland. But again, it's true for other European countries and languages as well. But I truly believe that what we were looking at, the fostering of the relations, it's not only the political people, but it needs to be people to people. And I see that there is also a growing interest. But sometimes you have to make people aware of the chances, be it economics, be it political, be it cultural exchange, and like students' exchanges, and Erasmus is wonderful and all that. So there's so much we can use, and I see an openness for it. Sometimes people, for whatever reason, still shy away from it, but it's good to go out there and explain about it and raise awareness and make people meet each other. So it's good.
And Aziliz, one of the, taking up from the points there that both Deike and Tony and Gavin in a different way have made. So as we move into this territory, as we look now at the arithmetics of Westminster, one of the pieces that you're studying is very much a rising high tide of populism throughout Europe, in that there is other very significant arithmetic to take place next year in the European Parliament, specifically in a, and some of the foreign policy which Ireland is now crafting needs to engage with kind of competing visions of Europe, which are increasingly being played out politically. Where is your work taking you to in that?
Well, thank you, Maureen. I am relieved that you're not asking me to comment on Brexit specifically, because it is true that it's not that Brexit lacks in twists and turns and shifts. So it has been very eventful, and we're only now at the end of the beginning of the whole process.
Yes.
So. But it's true, my own interest in the topic is slightly withered, and I think this is also a reflection of the state of the debate in France and other continental countries on Brexit. I mean, there's wider trends taking place, across Europe and indeed beyond, across the world. And this is what has focused my research recently. So, so I will say a few words about like this phenomenon of emerging or expanding, Europe-wide and worldwide. That there's all those new parties who are pushing. I mean, in Europe, it's very striking. They're pushing a new idea for Europe. One that is based on the defense of European civilization. So recast is being essentially white and Christian. And this is a very clear agenda, and the upcoming European elections will for the first time face this expanding coalition of parties who have for the first time quite a coherent discourse of what they want, what they envisage for the Europe of the future.
Coming from both the right and the left?
No, I'm thinking more particularly here of right-wing parties, and the emblematic figure is probably the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who's articulated very clearly that he envisages Europe as a bastion of sovereign nation states. and the emphasis is on sovereignty, and I think this cuts across what has been said on Brexit. And his vision is that those states should privilege the rights of native citizens inside, and that the cooperation between those sovereign states, the sovereign European states, should be focused on the defense of external borders. So I think what is really interesting is this return of the state, this return of an emphasis on the importance of social redistribution too in those political discourses, and this is very much, I think, a product of the 2008 crisis.
Yeah.
I mean, Gavin insisted on the fact that austerity in Britain had meant the destruction of the link between citizens and the states. So and the state, and you see this notion of the need for public intervention coming back very strongly, and this is also happening within a global context of competition between the Western-style model of liberal democracy and a new competing model of authoritarian capitalism embodied by a number of Asian countries, by China, but also by Mr. Erdogan in Turkey.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that you mentioned I've spent quite a few. I've spent some time in Poland recently, and in the discourse of the conservative right-wing party, Law and Justice, references to China and the Chinese model are proliferating.
Of industrial policy and
industrial policy, restoring the role of the state in industrial policy. So the role of the state is conceived as pushing national sovereignty rather than rather than shared sovereignty as the EU is based on, but rather national sovereignty externally. And this is very strong as well in Mr. Orban's vision. He sees states as engaged in a kind of a struggle for survival on an international arena, which is really for him an arena of struggle between nations. And then internally, the role of the state is reasserted. In terms of its role for development. And in Poland, the very striking fact is that the previous liberal government, the Civic Platform, had really pushed a model based on foreign direct investment and opening up the country to foreign investment. Well, I think this speaks to the Irish situation too. And Law and Justice have recast this model of development as post-colonialism. And so they developed a very interesting and very compelling discourse on the betrayal of the liberal elites. So they describe, it's interesting that a word is coming up very often in the published discourse, a word which used to be confined to Marxist intellectual circles, and that is the term of the comprador, who was in the old colonial world, was the native middleman
sold out.
who sold out
the gombeen.
The gombeen in the Irish context. And so Law and Justice are really describing the liberal elites as the compradors. And they're also, in doing so, they're also talking to a very particular section of the Polish population, and mostly they're talking to people who live outside of the big urban centers. And I think that this is very important because the power of that discourse, of that new right emerging across Europe, is not just based on its re-legitimization of social redistribution, but also it is based on a very strong discourse of dignity. So Kaczynski campaigned on the idea of Poland rising up from its knees, so as a nation, but also he's talking to people who live in remote villages in the east of Poland and who feel that they have no stake in the European promise, when that promise is only a promise of successful mobility and progress. And so
what strikes me about that, Aziliz, as you talk to some of your time, is that, you know, again, back to the centre and the periphery, some of the experiences of depopulation and emigration, we've seen it throughout referenda now too in Romania, and through a census which can be shared in many of the experiences we've talked in this room and Chris has talked on previous occasions, that's very real to places like the west of Ireland and to places like here, which over the years have experienced an exodus of young people which have struggled to assert the role of the region in relation to the city.
Yeah, no, I think this is very crucial, and I mean, just a few words on that experience of depopulation. So I'm not sure how familiar people are with you know, the situation of places like Bulgaria, Romania, while Poland has seen the departure of millions of people since becoming a member of the EU. So now in some kind of, so in the Baltic states, so Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, in Poland, in Romania, and Bulgaria, the entire, well, in general, here it's the west, there it's the east. Is really depopulated, and I've been to some villages recently in Poland where people say, well, look, all that remains are children, women, and a priest in Poland. And, well, people describe their experience, you know, the story is quite compelling. You know, they say, look, we did spend money giving our children an education because we wanted them to live better, and people have paid for English language classes in particular, and then they say, well, look, now our children wash dishes in London, and we miss the link to our children, to our grandchildren, and now we hear that in the UK, British people are complaining about Poles and Romanians. And we are facing huge labor shortages on our labor market. In Poland, those jobs are now filled up by Ukrainians, like in the wake of the war in Ukraine. Well, it is estimated that between 1 million and 2 million Ukrainians work in Poland. And, you know, those people tell you, well, there's a problem in that system. And I think that, you know, the challenge for social Democrats, you know, in years to come, because this is going to be a long-term project, is to manage to articulate a narrative that speaks, you know, to aspirations for place, for community, for identity. You know, those aspirations have come back in the form of very vehement political passions, while at the same time holding firm on liberal principles, you know, on individual freedom, on individual freedoms. Sorry, on you know, a vision also of our shared humanity that is not reduced to, you know, well, nativist conceptions. And also, I think, you know, a vision of our interdependency with all those who dwell on this vulnerable planet. And I think that this is also a challenge for Ireland, or that Ireland should have a task. Well, should have a role anyway, or a contribution to bring to this new narrative. And I agree that what the minister said previously on the experience of emigration in this country, well, and in regions like this one, in Dingle, you know, what do we do with that experience? You know, is it only
and maybe just
about
talk to us
the global?
About what you are doing personally in France right now, before we and Place Publique.
Oh well, no, well that's only you know, that's another story. But I mean, what
but
we are trying to do is to build, to try and
So you
and
see a
build.
place vacated, in effect.
Yeah, we're trying to build, a new party amidst the ruins of the French and European left. So something that is between, President Macron's political project and the populist left, which in France is called the France Insoumise and Mélenchon. So to build a pro-European left alternative. But this is going to take a very long time. I mean, I was talking recently to a compatriot of yours who's a good friend, to Timothy Garton-Ash, and he was reminding me that, for social democracy to emerge, it took Keynes to understand the Great Depression, the Great 1929 Depression. Then it took Beveridge to translate that into a kind of a broad policy program, and then it took Labour, was it Attlee or to turn that into an actual program and go and campaign and win elections, and that took decades. So the way we see it is that the alternative between the status quo, which Macron is very much embodying, although he does it with brio and he gives a sense of movement. It is still very much the old status quo. Between that, if you say that the only alternative is that or Orban, I think the strategy is very risky. I mean, it should be about which Europe do you want, not just about Europe or no Europe. Because the risk then is that you'll end up with no Europe, because people will, out of spite, just, vote for the no Europe.
Which, if we go back, is really the most sobering part of this conversation, in the sense of the risk of no Europe is not inconsiderable as we look forward over the next 5, 10, 15 years and face into potentially more challenging economic times in the next number of years. And at the same time, Gavin, you've ended up with scenarios which can end up in less desirable places relatively quickly. It's the interplay of both of these forces is the place and the time in which we find ourselves.
Definitely.
Well, it's a time of very deep uncertainty, not just in Brexit, but and a very perilous time, I believe.
I think the interplay between the points you've been making about identity and actually particularly how I think liberals with a small L and social democrats have struggled in British politics, but I think it's the same. I see it the same in France, and I think to some degree it's the same in Germany. But others will know better. We've struggled to make a case for kind of liberal beliefs, whilst recognising the genuine kind of hunger that people have to feel a sense of continuity, place, belonging to their patch, and understanding change around them. And we have kind of platitudes we say about we'll help you through change. And my experience, part of where we are today in my country is because the change that people felt in the 70s and the 80s in terms of deindustrialization and post-industrial towns, of course, I was involved in doing lots of things to try and help those places, but it was kind of superficial and light, and we never really got to grips with it. And we have been kind of waiting for something to blow for 30 years in many of those communities, and it's come around to get us. And if you don't take those issues incredibly seriously, and I mean, really throw everything you can have through democratic politics at solving those issues, then what we've learned is you get bitten.
But from a French perspective, the paradox of all this is that, there was a time when we had a French president of the European Commission, Jacques Delors, when social cohesion was one of the pillars of this whole European project. And seen from a French perspective, it's very paradoxical that Britain is leaving at the time when Europe is eventually resembling, the British dream of market only, and so this is something very, very disturbing.
Is there not a more optimistic? I mean,
Deike is trying to get
Well, you give us some optimism, and I'll tell you my optimism.
I think it is possible to note on I would hope that it's possible to end on a more positive note, because I mean, if you look at the figures, like here in Ireland, 92% of the people said they are pro-European. Just recently, an opinion poll came out in Germany as well. More than 80% said they are in favor of the European Union. And I don't have the statistical data for other countries, but I think there is hope. And as I said, I mean, Brexit really made us realize more, I think, how important this European project is and what it actually means and how deeply it's kind of rooted in our daily life and how it shapes our daily life. And that we are interdependent and that we are small if we are alone. And I think we need to talk even more about that. And obviously, I'm very fond of the civil society dialogues that we had, the citizens dialogues. We had more than 100 in Germany as well, and people really participated and really took it on. And so people want to get involved, and I think that is a very good basis. And also young people want to get involved. I don't know whether you heard about this Pulse of Europe, and they went out like every Sunday in Berlin and in other towns around Europe and basically protested for Europe, which is fabulous. So I think we need to talk more about the positive impacts, all of us, and then also sometimes remember where we came from. And we came from, and I've been around Ireland these days a lot, laying wreaths to remember the First World War and the casualties, and the Second World War obviously as well, and the atrocities. And this is where we came from. And this is why we decided we want this project. Yes, it's also economics, but it is a peace project. And I think we need to make that more tangible in our debates. And I think we are on the way. So I hope that more people realize how important this is for us and for a peaceful future together on this continent.
And on that note, I am going to draw to a close. Going to thank our guests very much. Deike, I think, has been calling for an infusion of energy. We are going to get one now from a woman who wowed the church last night, Courtney Marie Andrews. She is from Phoenix, Arizona. Herself and Philip are going to chat here, and she's at the moment calling the road her home. And that road has taken her through some considerable period spent through Europe. So it's our pleasure now to vacate the stage. Thank you, and